Hello and welcome to Food Safety Fridays. My name is Simon Timperley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Today we're going to be talking about FSSC 22000 version 5 with our special guest Jennifer McCreary from NSF International. Welcome, Jennifer. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Simon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I guess, however it's appropriate to, I'm looking at where all the folks are coming from on the chat there.
Indonesia, Germany, Delhi, New Delhi, Philippines, literally all over the world. It's fantastic to see. It's fantastic to be able, through the power of the internet, to bring us together. All of you from wherever you are all over the world. I'm in, rainy Manchester in the UK, and you're from, Jennifer?
I'm in Toronto. It's bright and sunny. I'm looking out and trying to ignore my garden right now since I have a more important thing to look after for the next hour.
Okay, right then. Well, I'll just say today's webinar is being recorded. The slides, the recording, and the certificate of attendance will be distributed afterwards, so don't worry about that if you miss a little bit. We have sponsors for this program throughout the year where we bring you this short burst of education. So I'll play the sponsors video ads and then we'll get stuck into the presentation. So I'll be back in a couple of minutes.
The world of food has changed a lot in the last 100 years. But one thing that doesn't change? Ensuring the quality and safe handling of food. No matter what changes are yet to come, we're proud to always be on our clients' side, shaping the future of food, today and tomorrow. AIB International, ever onward.
Okay, we're back. Thanks to the sponsors of Food Safety Fridays. And without further ado, we'll get on to the presentation. I'll be back to assist with the Q&A later. If you can hold your questions till then, or I'll still scroll to Australia or wherever. So I'll be back later. I'll hand you over to Jem.
Okay, thanks, Simon. I'm going to turn my video off so that I'm not having to look at myself as we go through today with that one. So again, welcome to everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, as appropriate for you. Before I get started into this, I'd like to thank Simon and IFSQN for this opportunity to speak with you today. So let's get started into an overview of FSSC 22000 version 5. So to start off with, I'm going to take you a bit on a bit of a time machine going back to 2005 when ISO 22000 was introduced. It was introduced really to help ensure the food safety of a product, but putting into place a management system that went along with that. The ISO 22000, it is applicable to anyone really who's directly or indirectly involved in the food chain. So from pet food to human food to packaging to retailing and all of the assorted allied trades that have to go into meeting that. I'm going to ask you kind of input your time machine in there. It's going back to that ISO 22000, 2005. When it came in, the major difference was having that requirement for a management system. So previously, with most of us had put in Codex HACCP that was there, that had the prerequisite programs, it had the requirement for putting a food safety plan in place, but it really didn't look at the management responsibility. And I think that that's one of the things that really, with the implementation of ISO 22000, 2005, having that requirement for that management responsibility, the documentation that was required that was there, the reviews that went into it, really strengthened our food safety programs that were in place. Now, one of the things that are right around that time was GFSI. I want to just step forward here and talking. So as you can see, the previous version was 2005. The current version of ISO 22000 was released in 2018. To go through, and so with that one that was updated and really looked, and we'll talk about more of what those changes were that were in place. But one of the great things with the release of the 2018 version was the fact that it came into that high level structure, so that for companies that had another ISO program, either an ISO 9001 so that they had it for quality, an ISO 14001 so it was environmental or perhaps occupational health and safety, that a lot of the clauses, a lot of the requirements, there was a consistency and there was an alignment between those programs that were there, so that people were able to put a management system in place rather than having a food safety management system, an environmental management system, a quality management system. Is that with the release of 2018 was that we now have a management system that includes food safety that was there. The other thing with ISO 22000 2018 was to really make sure that here was that keeping our eye and our focus on the fact that it is consumer safety. Sometimes in the past, we were really focused and got bogged down on customer requirements. And while those, we still have to make sure that we're considering those, in this case, it really is the consumer safety that's key. So as I said with this one, it was ISO that 22000, 2005. At that time, what happened was that was where we really had GFSI coming into play. And so the original ISO 22000, 2005, when it was submitted to GFSI for benchmarking, GFSI really perceived that the prerequisite programs that were outlined or listed within ISO 2005 were inadequate. Remember, part of it with GFSI is ensuring the consistency of the food safety program, so that looking at different GFSI standards, I mean, we have ISO 22000, SQF, IFS, to go through a number of them that were there. So the early version of ISO 22000, the 2005, was not initially accepted by GFSI because of, as I say, kind of that it lacked the detailed description of the prerequisite programs. It listed them out, but there wasn't a detail of what was required and what needed to be done. And so that's where, as you can see, the next part that came in there was the ISO TS, or Technical Specification 22002. And this lists the prerequisite programs. Now, even before, for those of you who've been involved with this for a while, know that that wasn't the first thing that came out. The first thing that came out was these came out as being PAS 220, which was for food manufacturing. So PAS stood for Publicly Available Specification, or if you were in the food packaging manufacturing, it was PAS 223, so publicly available specifications that looked and detailed the requirements around the prerequisite programs. So putting further information to what was required for a sanitation program, further requirements for what was required for the layout of the facility, the utilities that was there. Now, those original PAS documents, those publicly available specifications, were eventually transitioned into what I have up on the screen, that ISO TS 22002-X. And what the X stands for is that there were prerequisite programs that were developed for different industries. So there's prerequisite programs for food manufacturing. There's prerequisite programs for packaging, for animal feed that were there. Because as we know that, well, there's some similarities in what the requirements are that are needed for those prerequisite programs, there's also differences that are there. That for example, for packaging, most packaging facilities probably don't need a requirement for refrigeration and freezing for the safety of their packaging that was in place. Now, the difference is, and why that's an ISO and a technical specification, is that it's not a standalone to go through. It has to be used in conjunction with ISO 22000 2018, so that while a company could put ISO 22000 2018 in place and have it certified, it would not be GFSI. In order to be GFSI, it has to have the ISO 22000 2018 and then the appropriate ISO technical specification or prerequisite programs that are there. And then as Simon said, I'm talking about version 5 today, is that we know that eventually GFSI reviews and updates their benchmarking document. That happens approximately every 3 years. And so that they do, we don't have to go back and revise the ISO documents, because think of that ISO 22000, it had been 13 years since the first version of it, and now the 2018 version of it to go through. Is that with GFSI being every 3 years, there needed to be a more frequent way of being able to identify changes, to be able to look at what were the requirements from GFSI. And so that's where this FSSC 22000 version 5 publishes the additional requirements that they have that have been identified either through GFSI or through their own technical committee that's in place. And I strongly recommend, if you do not already have it benchmarked, that you access the website, the FSSC 22000 website. It's www.fssc22000.com. Very easy to remember. That's there. And there's a lot of supporting documents that you can download there. So there's supporting documents around what are the requirements for the certification bodies, for training centers, and then the additional requirements that would be there, such as the ones that are in version 5. Some of the other supporting documents that are there are, for those, because I noticed we have a number of people who are on the line today from the US, plus probably have a lot of folks on today who export to the US, so that you are under the FSMA requirements as well, is that on that website is they have updated their FSMA comparison, the FSMA comparison to the FSSC documents that are in place, so that you're putting your food safety management system there, but you're also meeting that regulatory requirement of FSMA. There's guidance documents for how to implement the program, and then one of the ones that we'll be talking about at the end of today is food fraud and food defense. So there's some additional guidance documents that would be there. So a very valuable website to go to and to keep up to date with what the requirements are that are in place. Now, as I said, that X that's on there with that ISO technical specification 22002-X there's ones that are appropriate. So they've been published so that they're appropriate for the industry. So starting on the far left, that ISO 22002-1 that's for food manufacturing that takes place. So anybody who is involved in the manufacturing step of the food chain, regardless of size or complexity. The next one there is for food packaging to go through. So it looks at the manufacture of the food packaging, not when you're putting your food into the package. That would come under the first one that's there. But this one is manufacturing of that package that you're going to, food contact packaging that you're going to put your food in. The next one is for feed and animal food. So animal feed for the animals that are going to go for food for us, or it also includes pet food that would be there, or animal food for the animals such as cattle, kind of dairy cattle and chickens and things to go through. And then transportation, I don't want to spend too long on this, catering, and then food retail. So you would select the appropriate technical specification for the industry that you are in to go through and to put that's in place. Okay, so some key elements. And I think that one key element, and I mentioned this briefly before, the one key element that is in the ISO 22000 is that management system. It's really a key difference between our Codex HACCP, that program that was there, and ISO 22000 2018 that's there. So because Codex HACCP, if you go back and look at Codex HACCP, it had the good hygiene practices that were similar to our prerequisite programs and the requirements around there. It had the HACCP, that hazard analysis and critical control points. But what it didn't have was that management systems that were there, that role of management. Because if you think about the 12 steps of HACCP, the first step is to select your HACCP team, your food safety team. It really didn't identify that role of management. And so there was nothing kind of about management commitment that was there, the requirements for policies, procedures. And we know that several times when we have had recalls or we've had food safety failures, it's because management didn't understand or that they went against the food safety programs that were in place. So I think that that's a very key part of our ISO 22000. Some other things, I already mentioned the high-level structure that was there. Some other things that came in with the ISO 22000 was the focus on the process approach, that when we think of a process, that's a series of actions or steps that we take to make sure that we're achieving a particular end. And in our case with food safety, that's that the food that we are supplying is safe. So we've got inputs, outputs, you're making, decisions, there's tasks that have to go into that. And so when we think about it, to go through, is that when we think about that it looks at that process. Think about receiving. So I mean, receiving, if we think it's just from A to B, but when we start to look at it from a process, it's like, okay, how do we make a decision on the safety of that product? What do we do if we've decided that it's not safe? What are the resources that we need to put into that? The inputs are the supplier approval programs, responses back to suppliers. So there's a lot of things when we think about the process that we need to consider. And when we don't think of these different practices as being processes, then it is where we find those gaps and we have failures to go through. And then the other one is that risk-based thinking. And so with risk is the effect of uncertainty. And that effect of uncertainty, that can be both a negative, which we tend to think of with food safety. We tend to go directly to a negative or food safety. But with ISO 22000-2018, it can also be an opportunity. So it is that uncertainty that we have, but we have an opportunity. So think of, for example, a company that's considering adding cannabis to their product line. We've seen a lot of that over the last few years that to go through. And so the negative parts of that, the risk that might be a bit negative would be, we've got legal requirements. Are we going to be able to ship it? We know that in the US, there's various states that don't accept it. So are we going to run into legal and regulatory issues? Are we going to impact our current line? Are our customers going to be concerned about the introduction of cannabis into our product? But if we look at the positive side of that, and this is really where the risk-based thinking comes in, is we have potential new markets. And so we have to go through and we have to look at that risk in the context of the organization. And so it may mean that we determine that, yes, there's enough of a value that we're going to take that risk of adding cannabis to our products. The third one with ISO is our Plan, Do, Check, Act, and that's what I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at to go through. With this one, is that Plan, Do, Check, Act, as you can see here, is goes back to Deming that was there. It's looking at it. It's a 4-step model that we have for carrying out, really looking at change and implementing change that would be there. So ISO 22000 is using this PDCA, this Plan, Do, Check, Act model that's there. And just to highlight that's in place is that it's a circle. There's no beginning, there's no end to it. So as we put the plan, hopefully we're starting off with the plan. As we put it in place, implementing it, we're carrying out what we said we were going to do. We're checking it, we're verifying it. And then if we find that we had a non-conformance, we're acting to correct or put corrective action in place, or that the other one that we have, because we know that there's no perfect facilities, we're acting to improve. So that's our continual improvement that we go through. So it's a planning tool. It's a project planning tool that we have to look at. And with ISO 22000, they put this PDCA cycle at 2 levels. One is at the organizational planning and control level that's there. And then the second one is at what we would have kind of historically called HACCP, or the realization of safe products, is at the operational planning and control level that's there. So it looks at these 2 levels, go through. So when you first look at that, there's arrows going different ways that are in place. So let's kind of break this down and see what the intent is at each of these steps. Go forward. So the first one that we're going to look at is our plan. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the ISO, different ISO standards, what those numbers that are on there is they refer to specific clauses within ISO 22000-2018 to go through. And so it makes it a little easier, because now it's just not going, okay, well, what do I need to plan? But it's telling you where planning should take place. That's theirs. And I think that this is one of the most important parts, is that planning, because we have on this next slide, if we fail to plan, we plan to fail. This is a saying that's often attributed to Benjamin Franklin. Depending on where you look, there are different authors that take credit for it. But I think really with this one is to look at that, and perhaps not who said it, but just really looking at, if we don't plan out what we're going to do, what resources we need, how we're going to go about achieving it, how we're going to confirm that we're meeting it, that's going to be really, really difficult to put in place that's there. So in this case, we are not planning to fail, so we're going to put a plan in place that's there. So the first thing that we have to look at to go through is this plan. So when we look at this, the first one is the context of the organization. And I said, with this one, it's really, and I think oftentimes when we looked at codex, we jumped right into the food safety, identifying the food safety hazards that were there. Whereas this one is saying, okay, let's take a step back. Let's look and make sure that we understand our own organization. So what are the issues that we might come into, that we need to address, whether they're legal issues, regulatory issues, kind of competition that we're into, the market that we're in today. We're adding to that list more and more, food fraud, food defense that's there. So how do those different issues, what impact do they have on our organization, both from an opportunity standpoint, as well as what is the a negative that would be in there. In conjunction with the context of the organization, we have to look at stakeholders. And as I mentioned before, ISO 22000-2018 is taking us away from just looking at our customer. We still have to look there. But now we have to look at who are the other stakeholders that we have that have an impact on our organization. So shareholders wanting a return on their investment, employees wanting to work in a safe environment, produce a product that's safe. We have regulatory people, so we have to make sure that we're meeting regulations. We have suppliers. We may have, depending on what business you're in, you may have special interest groups. Think of in the slaughter industry and things like that, special the groups who perhaps don't like the work that they're doing. We may have certification, so to go through a certification body or particular association certification. So they all have expectations and needs that we have to balance off against our own organization as well. And so then looking at that is then looking at what are the processes that we have to ensure that are safe. Looking at leadership, and this was previously management commitment. I'm really glad that ISO changed this to leadership, and you're probably going to be seeing more about leadership that's in the next while. Some of you may already be very familiar with it, but one of the key topics that was announced at GFSI 2020 in Seattle back at the end of February was the additional focus on food safety culture. And food safety culture looks at leadership to go through. It looks at how do we put the values of food safety, the behaviors that are there, that we're making sure that we're doing the right things for food safety. So leadership is in there. So I'm looking at that is that the commitment that's there, and then really that communication that they have, communication to all those stakeholders that we identified under the context of the organization. What is the communication that we have from them, as well as the communication that we want to send to them about what we're doing with food safety. And then that leadership is the selection of our food safety team leader and our food safety team to go through and spending time on that, really looking and saying, who is the best person for this? I know in a lot of cases, historically, our default was to select the QA manager, but is there someone else who may have a similar qualification, but really is a better leader for our food safety team to go through? And then planning is really, it's now going back to, again, those issues that we had, our stakeholders that we had. What are the actions? So now we come into the planning of the actions that we're going to put in place to address those opportunities and risks that we had. Going in place that's there, planning for the changes, what communication that we have to go through, and then looking through all of that plan, what are the resources that we need? So that goes into that support. Those resources from people resources through to the infrastructure, the buildings that we're in, the equipment that we have that's there, the work environment that's in place. So meeting all of those requirements. And remember, we haven't even really got to identifying hazards and controlling hazards. This has all been planning. It's been looking at where our organization is, what the impacts are, what our risk and opportunities are, and then planning and looking at what resources we need. The next one we come to is the do, and this drops us down into that second PDCA cycle, which is our operational planning and control, which kind of typically historically we looked at as being HACCP, but as you can see now, we've sort of moved away from the terminology of HACCP, and we can see that with different regulations that are being published as well, with FSMA to look at HACCP. I am in Toronto, and so we are under the Safe Foods for Canadians regs that are here. And so they talk about control measures, preventive control plans, not HACCP, that they are in place. So with the planning, so in this case with looking at operational, is starting on the left is looking at those prerequisite programs. So those prerequisite programs general to the site, back to that ISO 22002, the technical specification that was there. So what are the prerequisite that are appropriate? They may be in that ISO 22002, but making sure that what we have put in place is appropriate for what we do, so that we're ensuring the environment that we're operating under is conducive to food safety. So it's not introducing things that would be in place. So thinking of those prerequisite programs, having those in place. Traceability, the traceability system, that's another one that you're going to probably be hearing more about from GFSI, that there was additional focus with GFSI and again, the country regulations that are in place. Typically one back, we talk about one back and one up. With ISO, we need to look and also is that not just going back to where we got it from, but where does it move through our facility? When it comes in, when it's been received, and then it's being used, we've got work in process, WIP, that would be there. So what does it get mixed into? If we're reworking product, how would we trace that? Making sure that if it's going through and being able to track it, packaging to go through those food contact materials that we have for traceability that we have. And then finally, what we would probably have previously called crisis management is now emergency preparedness and response. And with the pandemic, it's interesting. I wonder how many of us had COVID-19 or even a pandemic in our emergency response. We've probably done more pivoting and adapting in the last 3 months, 3 to 6 months, depending on where we're located, than we've ever done before. And then we get into the hazard analysis. So this is really going through is looking and saying, what's identifying that hazard? And this is a key thing that's changed as well. Typically, in the past, what people had done was they would put down, it was, they'd identify the general hazard, whether that was, let's say, foreign material. What ISO now requires is that you're specific. What is the foreign material? Is it metal? And it doesn't require you to do this, but I strongly recommend, what are the conditions that foreign material would come from? So is it coming in ingredients? Is it coming in from a breakdown of equipment to go through? And then going through with that, because now it's hazard, it's not just hazard identification, it's hazard analysis. It's identifying it and then assessing it. What's the likelihood and the severity? What is, coming out with significant food safety hazards that would be there to look at that, and then identifying what are the control measures for those significant food safety hazards. What are the control measures? Typically, with HACCP in the past, we would have defaulted to CCPs. One good thing about ISO is the OPRPs, the Operational Prerequisite Programs. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time coming up going through Operational Prerequisite Programs, but I am going to tell you again back to that FSSC 22,000 website. There's that guidance document, has some excellent advice and additional guidance on how to determine whether we have an OPRP or a CCP. Now, one of the things that we have with that validation of those control to go through when we've identified those control measures is we have to make sure that they're effective. That's that validation that's there. Too often in the past, we just said, oh, this is what we've always done, and this is what we're going to continue to do. Well, unfortunately, what we always had done wasn't necessarily safe under all of the conditions that we ran. So now you're having to look and prove the effectiveness of that control measure that you've identified is effective against controlling that significant food safety hazard. And then from there is having those HACCP, our critical control points, and OPRPs. And probably one of the easiest ways to do this is to know that HACCP is a step in the process. A step in the process. So for example, you may look and say, okay, we package food. So a potential hazard, packaged ready to eat food, it's packaged, sandwiches that would be there, and we package it manually. And so one of the hazards is potentially people's contamination from people's hands. Staph aureus is one of the ones that's most there. When we look at that, we can look and going back to that likelihood and severity, it's in absence of a control measure. You may say, well, I've got hand washing. Well, hand washing is not a step in the process, but it is necessary to control the transfer of Staph aureus from people's hands to a ready-to-eat product that would be there. Even with gloves, we want to look at that. So that's really what that fits in to go through to look at that. So with validation, we have to prove the effectiveness to go through. With our CCPs, it's a measurement. With our OPRPs, is it could be an observation. It may be a measurement, but it could also be an observation. And then we've got finally verification planning. So this is, what are we going to do? Who's going to do it? When? Perhaps directions on how. What are the practices we're going to carry out to make sure that we're doing what we've said we're doing? Okay, and now we'll come into the implementation of the plan that for food safety. So now this is where we're carrying out the monitoring, the measuring, the observations of our CCPs and our OPRPs that are there. That going along with that, especially with the CCPs, because it's a measurement, that we're going to probably have a measuring device, a thermometer, perhaps a pH meter that would be there to go through. And so we know that some of those devices, that they don't always keep their calibration, or especially if they're dropped or somebody fools around with it. So that's where that control of monitoring and measuring is ensuring that any of the tools, any of the equipment that we're using for making a food safety decision is calibrated and is kept in that calibration, that to go through and to look at that. And then finally is because sometimes is that it is that product and process nonconformities is things don't always go the way that that we think they should. So now we have to look and say, okay, we've got product that's potentially unsafe. So a correction is that immediate that we look at holding that product, segregating it. Really what we want to ensure is that we are not releasing that product, that it's not getting used accidentally if it's a work in process, if it's a WIP product, or that it's not getting released into the market that's in place, that it's there. Oh, I want to go back. Control of product and process nonconformities. If it is a failure of a CCP, or we've determined that it's a potentially unsafe product, now we have to determine what our disposition is going to be. And so, you know, it might be that we can reprocess the product. We might be able to redirect it into a different channel. Prior to FSMA and animal feed, when I was in industry, if something didn't work out with people food, we would redirect it to animal food that was in place. But today, with all the new regulations and things like that, it's getting harder to just say, oh, just send it to the animals, or it may need to be destroyed. And so that's what we're looking at to ensure that that's in place. Okay, so we've done the planning, that's there. We've carried out the monitoring, the calibrations that we have, the control of that product are doing. We now need to check. And so in this check, there's two things. One is that we're looking at the verification activities that we looked at, that we planned earlier. Are those being done? Are they being carried out? Are they being carried out the way that we had planned them? We have to ensure that the person who's carrying out those verification activities cannot be the same person who conducted the monitoring. I know that FSMA does allow that, but under FSSC 22000, ISO 22000, it cannot be. And then all of those verification activities, and this is something that's carried out by the food safety team. So looking at those verification activities, bringing those in. So for example, are we, we may be making corrections, but that analysis of verification activities is, are we making corrections too frequently? We might be under the do going, oh, yep, we've got the controls that are there, we're making corrections. But when we check them and when we're analyzing them, are we perhaps making corrections too frequently? So it might be that the operator's fooling around with the, with the settings that it's there, perhaps to go through. It might be that we've got equipment variability that we have, or there might be variability in the raw materials that's causing us to have to, if we're making those corrections that are there. And then finally, with this one is the act. So we go back and we look and have the characteristics that we identified at the beginning, of the characteristics of the raw material or the food contact materials. Have we removed an allergen, or maybe more serious, have we added an allergen to our product? Have we moved from glass to flexible packaging? So now we may have oxygen or vapor transmission that we need to consider. Have we changed the risk groups in our intended use? So are we now supplying baby food? And so going back and looking at those verification activities, the results of those verification activities, what changes do we need to make? And going back and looking at our flow diagrams, our process descriptions, all of that, the prerequisite programs, our emergency preparedness, what changes do we need to make? And then we get to start that cycle. As you can see, we get to start it all over again. And really what it is that what can we do better? That continual improvement that's there. And then coming back to the organizational planning. So again, we have a check here. So we've got the plan, do, check. That in this, we look at the overall effectiveness of our food safety plan. We looked at it specific to that plan, do, check, act, the hazard analysis that we had in the operational planning. But we need to look at all of this in conjunction with internal audits, external audits, our hazard control plan, going through and looking at those verification activities. Were there things that showed up in our verification activities that didn't show up in our internal audits? And then making sure that that is all communicated as part of the management review that's there. So pulling that information that's in place, looking at it, have we, again, remember ISO, say what you do what you say, prove it. So that, all of that, monitoring, prerequisite programs, hazard control plan, that is all communicated to our management review. And this going back to that leadership that we talked about earlier under that planning, is now leadership, our senior management, our leadership has to ensure that the food safety management system is still adequate and effective. They're involved in that. If it's not, what's needed are there additional resources? So this is the output that comes from that management review. So are there additional resources that are needed? What needs to be updated, or what can we improve upon that we looked at that's there? And so that brings us to our last act of improvement. So this is where that top management is ensuring that the organization is continually improving the food safety management system. So through communicating with those stakeholders that we mentioned at the beginning that was there, through looking and being involved in that management review and providing the output that's there. What are the resources that are required? Ensuring that continual improvements in place, that internal audits are being carried out, and then the updating of the food safety management system itself, and ensuring that those updates to that food safety management system again are effective. And so as we have with the other ones, it is not finished. It's a cycle. There's no end point that's there. So we go back and we start it again. We hopefully are moving up. That's that continual improvement, that our food safety system, we know that there is no perfect food safety system. It needs to be continually evolving and improving. And so that's what that PDCA has that's there. Just very quickly, because I'm looking at my time here, just to look at those prerequisite programs. This is the one that has to go along with that ISO 22000. It's not a standalone. It's done in conjunction. So this is an example of that ISO 22000 Part 1 that is applicable to food manufacturing. So you can see down through there the different requirements that are in place. And just to give you an example of how they are applicable to different processes, is that with food packaging manufacturing, well, we have rework and kind of recall that would be under product recall procedures. Under the food manufacturing, under food packaging, that would be withdrawal procedures, because they would not typically recall. So if we look at recall as being that is not in compliance with food legislation, it's probably the company who put their product in there that's recalling it. So in this one, it's, what are the responsibilities? Who does it? When do they do? The frequency of it? What are the requirements that they have? Are there things, again, that they're measuring? And then ensuring that there are records to back that up. And then with this one, it's the last part that makes that FSSC 22000 version 5 are the additional requirements. And so the first one is where that we build on it. So that management of services, you're going to say, well, wait a minute, I already have management of services in my ISO 22000 2018. It's section 716, under the resources that are there. But this one is specific to when you use an external lab for doing testing to make a decision on the safety of a product. And so it is said that with these ones, we have to have additional requirements on how do we determine the competency of that lab, who's giving us those results that are there. Product labeling, here it's kind of looking, is sort of, should have probably been common sense, but we know that common sense not really necessarily common, is that the product should be labeled according to the country of sale. Food defense, food fraud, those are the, kind of the assessments that are there, and then putting a plan in place, making sure that we are mitigating that. And again, looking at the FSSC 22000 website, there's some good guidance to go along with that food defense and the food fraud. I think logo is fairly to go through. The one thing that I want to bring to your attention, I realized when I was going through this morning that I missed a correction. That 2.5.8 product formulation is actually for animal feed and pet food. It's not just dog and cat food. It's animal feed and food. It's the whole category D that would be there. And what that is that's looking at managing of nutrients. So additives that are added to into the animal feed to make sure that, number one, they're safe for the animal, and number two, that they're there so that the animal thrives in place. So remember at the beginning we had that FSSC 22000 2018 was that combination of the requirements for ISO 22000 2018. The difference, FSSC 22000 2018 requires ISO 22000 2018. It requires the appropriate prerequisite program, and it also requires these additional requirements if they are applicable to your organization as well. And I know I went through that fairly quickly. If you're looking for more information, I explained to Simon that this is normally what I went through is normally what I take something to be 2 days. So that is where you can find more information for us and our webinars that are there. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention to go through. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Simon.
Okay, thanks very much, Jen. A lot to go through in an hour, like you say. So obviously a 2-day course goes into a lot more detail. So we can, I want to give a special mention to Narong Chai. Whenever we have especially ISO 22000 FSSC, he is an expert on this subject, and he's answered a lot of questions in the sidebar, which has been great.
I noticed that during the chat, so I echo Simon's comments there as well.
Much appreciated. But let's pick up on some questions anyway. So Abhay, what are the additional requirements under 2.5.9? What's in that section? Additional
2.5.9. What that one is the so that's for retail and transportation only. What that one is that the transportation conditions minimize the potential for contamination. So think of something that you were transporting less than load, so that there might be something else on that transport. So what are the practices that you put in place, the requirements that you put in place to make sure that your food product isn't contaminated by, I mean, he used one, it was a company who was receiving a skid of flour. When the transport backed up and they opened it up, they were carrying embalming fluid with the flour.
Okay. Another question there. Can you see that, Jen?
Okay.
If you're already certified to ISO 22000, do you need to be certified to FSSC 22000?
What it is the FSSC 22000 is the GFSI. ISO 22000 2018 is not GFSI benchmarked. So if your customer requires you to have a GFSI certification, you have to go with FSSC 22000. If your customer is saying, I just want you to have a food safety management system, stick with ISO 22000. It's probably going to be what, again, back to that planning that goes into it. What are the expectations of your customer?
Okay, here's a challenge for you, Jen. Fires, define in one sentence the difference between OPRP and PRP.
Okay, a PRP is general, so that's really establishing the environment that we're operating under. So, you know, the layout of the equipment and etc. Is that what an OPRP is that when we go through and we identify a hazard, and we identify that hazard as being significant. So think of, I'm going to use hand washing again. So hand washing employee practices is a prerequisite program. But if I'm working with ready to eat product and perhaps I'm a smaller organization and I have people manually packing that product. One of the hazards would be the transfer of, for example, of Staphylococcus aureus from my hands onto the product. That is a significant food safety hazard, in which case we need to have a control measure. So my control measure now is hand washing. So that hand washing, I have to make sure that people are washing their hands, that we've put the practices in place, that that's an OPRP, so that I'm looking when people return from break to go through and looking at that. So there's additional control measures. It's what is the soap that I'm using? Is the soap capable of removing, of looking at the Staph aureus that's there? So that's really, so what it comes down to is it comes back to the hazard analysis. If we have identified a significant food safety hazard, then we either have a CCP or an OPRP.
Okay.
Sorry, that was more than one sentence.
Slightly more. That question comes up so much on the forum. It's untrue.
Go through, as I said, go back and look at the FSSC 22000 website at the guidance document. There's some excellent advice and guidance in that guidance document.
Yeah, I might include that in the follow-up email, actually. Let's see. If a supplier defaults on the surveillance audit, is it captured on the FSC supplier database? Would you know that?
I do not know that, Harmeet. I'm not sure.
Fazan is asking, what's the difference between a CCP and an OPRP?
A CCP is a step in the process. So going back to hand washing is not part of the process. The other thing is that you may have an OPRP that's setting up a piece of equipment. It might be a step, but there's multiple control measures that go into it. That is an OPRP. A CCP is a step in the process. So kind of that difference that's there.
Okay. What's section 2.5.7? Do you know offhand, Jen? Anything new in that particular section?
No, I think what it is I didn't add to my notes there because I saw somebody put in FSMA. It's just that there has to be an environmental monitoring program. So you have to look at it based on risk. So setting up your testing, setting up what you're going to test for, like what are the indicator microorganisms? Where are you going to take your sampling sites? How are you going to respond if you get some positives that would be there? So it's putting a plan in place.
Okay.
So if you already have an environmental monitoring program under FSMA, then you
should be okay.
Yep.
Matthew Coleman, he said at Simon, it only appears if the certificate is suspended or withdrawn. So if a certificate is suspended or withdrawn, then it will reflect on the FSSC database.
Okay.
Maro, do I have to apply all the PRPs present in the ISO TS 22002-1, or can I choose what to apply?
You have to choose what is appropriate for your industry. If there's something that you choose that you say isn't appropriate, doesn't apply to me, I would have documentation as to why you are saying it does not apply to you. As far as I know that in the standard it says should. It's not mandatory, it's a should. But I would be prepared to say why, if there was something that you hadn't applied, why you had omitted it, and have evidence that you do not have a food safety issue as a result of omitting that particular prerequisite program.
Okay. Is microbiological testing validation?
It depends.
Okay.
You can set it up and do that testing that's there, but it kind of goes along the same way that when people talk about testing swabbing for allergens. The validation is proving that it's effective. So you have to, if you are looking at it, you have to ensure that the practices that you are confirming have been carried out correctly. It also may be that you would have to do additional swabbing, additional testing, microbiological swabbing and sampling for that validation. There's a Codex validation and verification white paper. It's a few years old now, but it has some directions around validation. I think FDA also has some direction around validation as well. So I'm back to it. It depends on it. I can't just say yes or no. It depends on how it's carried out, your planning that goes into it, what you're testing for, where you're testing, the frequency of that testing is all goes into that validation. And so you have to set it up yourself.
Okay. Can you just clear this up? Chandra, is ISO 22000 GFSI recognized?
No, it is not. It is only ISO 22000 2018 is a part of the FSSC 22000 2018. And to become GFSI, you have to have those three components: the ISO 22000, the appropriate prerequisites, the ISO technical specifications, and the additional requirements from FSSC. Those are the three things that are recognized by GFSI. And I don't think I mentioned it, the FSSC 22000 was benchmarked by GFSI at the end of February this year.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that, Jen. Noah, what's the main difference between ISO 22000 2018 clause 7.1.5 externally developed elements of FSMS and clause 7.1.6 control of externally provided processes, products, or services?
Okay, 715, that would be that you bring in a consultant. An example, you might have different ones. So you bring in a consultant to help you out with, or to develop your food safety management system. So they come in, they say, you know what, I'm going to document all of your prerequisite programs. I'm going to develop your hazard plan for you, to identify your CCPs and your OPRPs. I'm going to do all of that for you, and I'm going to hand it over to you. What you have to look at is you can't abdicate that responsibility. Yes, you can bring them in, but you still need to look and say, is that person qualified? Is what they have developed for me represent my facility? I had conducting some audits. They weren't ISO audits, but conducting some audits of different food safety plans. And I realized that they had used, I think it was 4 or 5 different companies. They had used the same consultant because I found the same spelling mistakes through each of them. All the consultant had done was change the title, the company's name at the top. They were not specific to the industry themselves. The control of the externally provided processes is that they're doing something for you. So they might be perhaps they're doing some sterilization for you. One of the ones that an example that I've used is if you had somebody who was doing destruction for you. So you had product that you were destroying and you sent it off to a destruction. You'd want to make sure that, number one, they were actually destroying it. We have had and that product did not end up back into the retail market. We've had examples where product had been pulled back from recalls. There was a significant food safety hazard that was with them. It was sent out for destruction and it wasn't destroyed. That it was actually sold back onto someone else. I've seen that with packaging that's happened that went through that, and I've seen that with food products as well. So it's really making sure that if you have a service that's been provided or a product that's been provided to you from an external, that they are doing what they are supposed to be doing with it.
Okay. Leah's asking, in the current times with the COVID-19, a certificate's going to expire. What are the options for certificate renewal and audits currently?
I'm going to direct you to go back to your certification body to get the answer. So what the certification body is doing there, I know that they've been looking at possibility of remote audits to go into it. That there's a lot of different discussions with that one. So Leah, I'm gonna recommend that you go back to your certification body to get what they are doing for you.
Okay, let's see. Can you see any more questions there?
I don't off the top of my head
No.
to go through.
I think, right, we've gone 10, 11, getting on for 12 minutes over.
As usual, I tried, Simon. I apologize. I always go over.
It's worth the extra time, of course. So, yeah, it's been great, as usual, Jen. So thanks for your time today. I really appreciate it, putting this together and condensing what is a 2-day course offered by NSF International into 1 hour. If you got out a lot out of this, maybe head over there and take on the further training. Okay, so Jen, have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks,
Simon. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Right, ladies and gents, I have loaded the certificate in the sidebar. We'll be following up with an email in an hour or so with the recording, the slides, and the certificate. Regarding the certificate, it's a PNG image. You can either print and sign your name with a pen, or you can open that image in an image editing software such as Microsoft Paint and add the text, your name. Great. Thanks very much to Jennifer McCreary, NSF International. It's great having so many of you along here, and I love it. And we'll see you next week. We've got one next week, so watch out for the emails, and take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Have a lovely weekend and stay safe. Bye.